Really, the shot I liked at the end where he's holding the badge or whatever, the diplomatic immunity badge, right before the famous line, and he looks like the emperor, where he's just like he's literally just hamming it up, just like there's no way that you can get me, and then he just gets shot in the face. And that I love that in my villains. I love when they commit to being a villain.
Back again, back again. And we're back, and we're back again.
All right, and welcome everybody to season 2 of the Back Again podcast. As always, I'm Matt.
I'm still Drew.
And this is our sequel podcast. This is where we look at sequels from the past and we see if indeed they are worth going back ... again. And we are jumping into season 2 right off the bat with our action movie sequels, and we are doing the follow-up to the 1987 Lethal Weapon, and we are doing Lethal Weapon 2.
Hell of a way to start a season.
Hell of a way to start a season. Now, Drew, you've never seen Lethal Weapon before.
I've never seen either of these movies before.
Either of these movies. So why don't you go ahead and quickly tell me what your thoughts on the 1987 Lethal Weapon was upon first viewing.
To me, at least, or someone who thinks like me, it was definitely a blueprint for a lot of action movies that I had seen, and then finally seeing this, a lot of stuff made sense.
Yeah, a lot of references from like other kind of TV shows. That
It's almost the action movie equivalent of Airplane.
Yeah. Well, the first one comes out in 1987. It has a budget of $15 million. It makes $120 million at the box office. So that's enough for them to greenlight a sequel.
We like to call that a smash here in the industry.
Yeah. Lethal Weapon 2 comes out in 1989. And it has a budget of $30 million, so double what they had, and a box office of $227.9 million. So they really made double, if not more than that, on the second go around. It stars Danny Glover, Mel Gibson, Joss Ackland, Patsy Kensit, and Joe Pesci. And Richard Donner returns to direct. Lethal Weapon 2 picks up with Riggs and Murtaugh still partners chasing down a group of smugglers in possession of gold Cougars. They meet their match when they discover that the smugglers are actually members of the South African consulate, led by diplomat Arjun Rudd, and have been operating in LA for years, even before the events of the first Lethal Weapon. After a series of threats and then assassinations, Riggs and Murtaugh put their badges away and use their weapons to rescue their friends, kill the bad guys, and revoke their diplomatic immunity. So right off the bat, Drew, I don't know if you want to jump into it, but the thing that I like about this movie from the start is how fast it jumps into the movie, right? Because like the first Lethal Weapon, we have to establish the characters, we have to establish the meeting for the first time. But with the second one, it's like, no, they're partners. Let's jump right into the hijinks of what we're doing. And we get a pretty exciting kind of car chase, and as well as them kind of yelling over each other of who should drive the car. There's just a lot of chaos going on, and it's a really kind of energetic way to start the movie.
I remember that I had seen that scene once out of context, and I assumed that it was like the climax of a movie.
Yeah.
They were really just throwing everything at you in the first few minutes. And yeah, I agree. For all of the action that's in the first Lethal Weapon, it does take a while to get started. But what I appreciate about that one is it keeps its momentum.
And it just looks better from the start of it. Like I would say the direction's better. And I just think like the acting's better. Like even with them yelling over each other, just they have more chemistry kind of built up in the
there's more
second
chemistry.
one.
How much time passes between the two movies and World?
You know what I think it might be? Because, you know, the first movie takes place at Christmas. This might be like the summer after Christmas.
I guess, yeah, it makes sense.
Because it is kind of summertime.
Yeah.
Some other things that I like about this sequel, just to kind of talk about scenes that we like. I like when Riggs and Trish are talking about the gold pen scene that she finds in the laundry while she's doing his laundry. And even though his speech about his dead wife is very kind of melodramatic and cliche, there is a little moment where Roger comes into the kitchen after they've kind of had this heartfelt conversation, and he reiterates like, oh yeah, we found your pen in the laundry. And then after he says that, you know, Riggs and Trish, they share a look. And in general, I just like the family dynamic scenes. I think they're fleshed out more. I think that they're believable.
I like that scene a lot more for what it did with Riggs specifically, because just looking, I guess, in tandem with the family dynamic, it really showed that he was becoming able to communicate with people who weren't Murtaugh.
Yeah.
It was, because I feel like that was the first movie, was him finding someone that he can communicate with, and then this movie is, they don't really go into it that much, but there are some hints of like him finding a network of people that he can kind of communicate with to an extent.
Yeah, I like it that they drop kind of like the suicide stuff from the first movie, and now it's like, oh, now he's kind of back on the market and he's trying to like get his life back together. And
well, now that he has that network, you know, he has the support.
Now that he's got Trish doing his laundry for him.
Exactly.
Some other things that I like, unless you want to jump in and say some things that
No,
you
keep
like as
going.
well.
I like, because there's a lot to this movie after coming off all these Disney movies. I really
Yeah.
got to like change my palate. So I need some time to adjust.
Well, another thing I like is the scene with the knife henchman, where he's just kind of messed up a mission, and the boss, Rudd.
That's not really a scene, is it?
Yeah,
It's like two shots.
Yeah, it's a real quick scene, but they work in a really nice joke where, he messed up the job and he's looking at his boss and he goes, "What are you doing?" And the knife guy looks under him and he's like, "Oh, I was just checking for plastic." Because before they had another guy in there who messed up the opening scene that we saw, the car chase scene, and he's standing on some plastic and the bad guy says like, "Oh, well, I was just painting in here. That's why there's plastic on the ground." But then, like, bam, they shoot him in the head and he's dead. So then later, the other henchman's messed up and he's just looking at the floor like, "I'm just checking there's no plastic underneath me." It's such a stupid, quick cut, but I thought it was
it's a really good joke, and it's because they do a lot of callbacks in this. It's probably one of my favorite jokes and one of my favorite callbacks. You keep saying like what your favorite lines are, and like all of them are like Mel Gibson's lines. I really like that line. I think that's probably one of my favorites.
Yeah, and like the comedy in general works better in this movie because in the first one, it's like, it's cheesy and it's cliche.
It doesn't mix with the drama very well.
It doesn't. Whereas in this one, they really make the characters kind of more rounded, whereas in everything they're saying is more believable, I guess. So
well, I think they took a lot of the inward drama and just made it more outward.
Yeah.
So then your characters can react to them in more comedic ways because they have a little bit of a disconnect because it's no longer about suicide. It's about like fighting for your life, which is something that Mel Gibson and Danny Glover can kind of deal with. I think they're a little bit more adept at dealing with that.
Yeah, and they just have more chemistry this time around, so that you can have these kind of like longer scenes where they're all joking around and giving each other shit, and it just feels like it fits in the movie a lot.
Well, that's the other part of it too, is just the fact that they have better chemistry. You can believe when they kind of pivot hard into comedy that it is more in their characters, or at least in their like relationship.
Yeah, I also I'll say, this second movie kind of focuses a lot on Riggs and as far as his backstory, and they work in.
Which I like because the first one kind of focuses a little bit more on Murtaugh. I guess no, it doesn't. The first one, I guess, is kind of pretty split, 50-50.
Murtaugh's kind of reactionary to Riggs and kind of it's kind of their worlds kind of colliding as the first one. Whereas in this one,
Riggs drives the plot and Murtaugh's there to react to it.
Yeah, whereas in this one, they are already kind of established in the same boat. So now it's really about growth. And the only way you can kind of grow is to kind of look at your past and see what's kind of undone. And they do that by making the knife henchman actually be responsible for Riggs' wife's death in the first one. So the car crash that she got into, he reveals to him while he's like, all chained up on the water. He's like, "Oh, so that thing, how you thought your wife died this way? And then Riggs is all like, and it's like you gotta add some of this stuff because you gotta give the film more depth. But I like it. I don't mind it. I think it actually gives it more depth, and it kind of gives us more motivation for our characters. It's a little convenient, but I still think that it works in the way that they execute it.
It makes sense. I don't think it needed to be there because immediately after that, when Mel Gibson's in the water, he sees that they killed his love interest.
Yeah.
And that, I think, was the only kind of heavy beat that you needed for that scene, or at least it was enough for me, because that kind of came out of nowhere. Usually I'm used to movies like this keeping the love interest intact for, one reason or another, but in this one they just kill her.
Well, I guess it's surprising too because she worked for them.
That too, yeah.
They knew her, so you don't really expect to see her in the
ruthless.
water. You almost expect her to be the kind of damsel in distress that's going to be in the third act that Mel Gibson's got to rescue, but instead they're like, "Nope."
Or like she ends up betraying him.
Yeah, even that too, but they're like, "Nope. Here's your motivation."
She did.
So I agree that was enough motivation. They really just kind of doubled down on it then when they introduced the whole, dead wife kind of backstory to it.
My wife.
But either way, the villains in this movie are a lot stronger. I think they're given more depth. The whole diplomatic immunity thing is absolutely ridiculous, and I'm sure that there have been plenty.
It's done well with its ridiculous.
Yeah, and there's been plenty of reviews and plenty of other YouTube people or just film reviewers that have talked about, this kind of obstacle that our protagonists have to get through. But it still is entertaining.
Well, what do they? I haven't seen those reviews. What do they usually like? What's the consensus? Is it like a lazy approach, or is it like?
Well, it just doesn't exist. It's just it's.
Oh, it's just completely
malarkey.
fabricated?
Yeah, it's just completely fabricated.
Well, I like that, though. Because
Yeah.
I like that they can do something like that sounds accurate.
Yeah.
Like, that sounds right. Diplomatic immunity, that sounds like something that exists. And then just commit to it just so much on its face.
Yeah, and you can...
Where it's literally like he believes that he can get away with holding up his badge after he just shot at a cop and say diplomatic immunity and think that he'll just get off scot-free.
And you feel them throughout the whole movie. Like, they have a presence. Like,
Well, they constantly get into Murtaugh's house.
Oh, yeah, they're breaking breaking into Murtaugh's house. They're literally killing and assassinating cops. And overall, they just feel like, I guess what I'm trying to say is this kind of cop story involves pre-established villains that have been doing something for a long time, and they just happen to come across the wrong cops. And as far as action movie or cop movie tropes go, like that's right in the wheelhouse.
Yeah.
So the fact that this is executed with good direction and just with a lot of kind of thought kind of put into like what we're setting up and what we're paying off, like I'm okay with that trope. And I think this movie is one of the examples of how that trope can work if you do it right.
Can we talk about something that I don't like, because I feel like we're just like on this movie's dick?
Yeah, so we can do that now because I think that's kind of like the last kind of thing that my big thing that I like about all the movie.
While I do like them trying to weave in these villains like backstory to like the past and like they've always been a presence, I really didn't feel their presence, especially in this movie, but in both movies. There's a lot of, or at least a handful of like one-off incidents where it's like they're dealing with something else. Like in the first one, I know they're dealing with a suicide or like a jumper. And then in this one, there's one scene at least where they're dealing with something else. It's Joe Pesci's character, but I feel like, is there some other incident that they get called in for?
Well, interesting enough, I think a lot of the little things that they encounter actually all relate back to the bad guys. So like,
Dude, I really felt like they don't, and that was my complaint.
well, they do, because Joe Pesci at first, they go to him because like, what did you witness? Like what's going on? After they save his life in the hotel room, he asks him, he goes, what did you witness? A murder or something? And then he reveals, Joe Pesci, that he's been laundering money.
I guess
for the
that's true,
guys.
yeah.
And then the other side
it
of it,
wasn't the fault of the movie. I just kind of assumed that they always knew that Joe Pesci was involved in the South African diplomat thing from the get-go, but I guess they did they?
well, you bring up a good point, because the first one does have a lot of those kind of separate incidents that
I missed those, honestly.
Yeah.
I kind of wanted to see one or two more of those, and I felt like they could have connected back as almost like a button, but
there are a lot of kind of side things that they do in this movie, but they are all related to the bad guys. So I do agree that
like directly. That's what I don't
even
like.
the opening scene,
Yeah.
like the car that they're
Exactly,
chasing
the car
kind of
chase.
jumps
I
into
would have
it.
liked to see those not be directly involved and then kind of like all circle back around.
Yeah.
But, you know,
Well, I'll give you
that's
something.
just preference.
Yeah, and I'll give you something I don't like about the movie in regards to one of the side things that they do. It's going to be the love interest.
Vonda House, yeah.
Yeah, the character's name is Rika Vonderhaus, and I really think
She's
that
Dutch.
yeah, she's Dutch,
The
and
Dutch.
she's kind of like a side mission for Mel Gibson, because he basically gets to a point.
Side conquest.
Yeah, because he gets to a point where he's like, I'm just going to seduce the secretary, the innocent secretary of this kind of evil organization, and I'm going to have sex with her. But
Well, is it for information, or is it because he's attracted to her?
I feel like at first, well, this is
It's
interesting.
definitely never said, right?
This is interesting that you bring this up, because at first it just looks like he's just attracted to her.
Yeah.
Or that,
He's attracted to everyone.
but also that he can kind of see a way in. So he's almost trying to like track her down. He's trying to find out information. There's only like one little moment where he says it, but yeah, it
He
really,
does actually say it.
yeah, because like at first when he meets her, it's like a combination of he's attracted to her, but then he's also like kind of treating her how cops treat like the one kind of innocent witness. We're like, oh, hey, like your boss over here, like, does he really care about this stuff? Like he's trying to kind of mooch her a little bit. Later when he's at the grocery store with her, it's obvious that he's still flirting with her. But then after that, when they're at his place on the beach, she's like asking him like, what did he do? Like, what did my bosses do? What do they do? Like, blah, blah, blah. Like, I don't want any part of this. So it appears that way, but really he just ends up sleeping with her. And then
And
when
he's
she,
just too focused on sleeping with her.
yeah, and then when she gets killed, she's really just motivation
Yeah.
kind of go forward.
Because that was true love.
Yeah, now there is a deleted scene where we show, before they go to see Leo, Riggs and Murtaugh are in the hotel, and Riggs gets sidetracked by some women in a hot tub, and he's kind of like overly flirting with them. And I actually like this deleted scene. I think it should have stayed in the movie, because Riggs is back on the market. He's kind of reaccepted his life. He's kind of looking for love again. So the fact that he's sidetracked off this mission and he's talking to these women, I guess is just somewhat of setup. Like, you just need to give me something. It doesn't
Yeah.
need to be good, but set up for then when he sees the secretary to kind of, lead in first with like, oh, did I tell you about my dead wife? Like, I'm ready to move on. But yeah, so I just feel like she's one of the weaker elements, just because I don't think they gave her anything in the script to do.
Well, we were talking about a couple like cool ways to like write around that. I know making her like a double agent would have been cool. Making her a villain.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, they don't do it. So for me, it's one of the weaker elements for it.
One of the few, yeah.
And then just in regards to characters, another kind of weak spot is I actually do like Joe Pesci as Leo, but there is one scene that's like too many for me, and it's when they're in the car after getting Subway, and he's got like the tuna sandwich, and then he's going on and on about how how they screw you at the drive-thru. And they screw you at the drive-thru. If you know anything about Lethal Weapon 4, they bring this back at Lethal Weapon 4 with Chris Rock, and it's a really annoying scene then too. But they screw you at the drive-thru, and then they turn him and tell him to shut up. And I like the dynamic between the three of them, but they just kind of overdo it. It's similar with Mel Gibson and his Adolf Aryan comments. Like the first three are good, but then there's like 6 after the fact where it just kind of goes on. And that's how I kind of feel with Leo sometimes. He's just kind of, it's a little too annoying at times.
That's what I liked about the first one, is there was more of an even spread with the characters. And with this one, it felt like Leo was definitely like kind of shoehorned in there a lot more than he needed to be.
I do like at the end of the movie when they kind of like let him flip the siren and they're happy that he's alive.
Yeah, like his arc is good, but it's just like it felt a little padded.
Well, there's a moment where Riggs and Murtaugh are outside the house about to go in, and he's like, just go in there and just shoot everyone up. And then Murtaugh tells him like they got Leo in there, and then Riggs goes, stay safe. So he's like, first he wanted just to go in guns shooting, but now that Leo's in there, he's kind of like precious cargo. So there is some kind of arc in regards to friendship and family in this movie that I think that they attempted. And even though it's like, it's stitched in through like a super cliche action movie, with one-liners and stuff, I do appreciate the fact that they put effort into those kind of stuff, or at least acknowledge those relationships and paid them off. And one of my favorite scenes from the movie is after they have attempted to try to blow up Murtaugh on his toilet, they put in this plan. And this whole plan, there's so many things I like about these sequence of scenes. Like it first starts off with Murtaugh and Leo at the South African consulate building, I guess. And they're kind of doing some kind of shtick to distract everyone. It involves Murtaugh wanting to go to South Africa. They're like, but sir, you're black. He's like, oh, I know. And I just love the commitment that Murtaugh has to the scene of causing the distraction. And then even when he's outside, he's like cheering with the people and he's like really excited. So while he's doing that, Riggs is able to sneak in. He's able to get to the main office of the bad guys. He sees their kind of big fish thing. He steals a piece of paper off.
What was that paper?
The paper off the desk, they were going to be able to kind of scratch over it later and kind of get an address, I believe, for like a shipment or something like that.
Oh, it was the name of the ship, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was the name of the ship. But after the bad guys come in there, you just get Riggs facing off all of them. He's got his gun up, and he just says the famous line of,
"You fold up your tents and get the fuck out of my country, and I won't do anything to you. I'll leave you alone. Because if you stick around here, I'm gonna fuck your ass."
And just the commitment that he has in that scene. And then he does like the eeny, meeny, miny, hey Mo! And then he shoots the glass. And it's a ridiculous scene, but it fits so well with the movie because it's like our Western kind of standoff of like, we've each kind of been trading blows at each other this whole time. And now here's like the final standoff before we kind of get into the third act. So, yeah.
I actually want to talk about that toilet scene because it was the one time between the two movies that they did have a dramatic moment that I really felt, and it was like just the dialogue between them when they thought they were both going to die.
Or the lack of dialogue between
the lack of dialogue. Yeah, that was a perfect example of lack of dialogue.
Yeah.
Where their eyes are doing all the talking.
And I think that scene is what kind of replaces this movie with the kind of one-off scenes from the first one. Like they spend more time trying to have these kind of, adventures that relate to the plot, but also to kind of have these kind of emotional beats. But yeah, no, I agree. It's probably one of the better scenes in the franchise as a whole. And
I think it's one of the better acted scenes.
Yeah, for sure. And that actually, before we get into the ranking of this, there are a lot of callbacks and then there are a few one-liners. So I just want to go back and I want to start with the callbacks. So as far as callbacks go, there is the sports magazine. So Murtaugh's son put the sports magazine in the trash, and Murtaugh says, hey, I want to read that later, so put that back in the house. That is the magazine that he was trying to read on the toilet before he goes kaboom. Another one are the condoms, I guess, because Murtaugh goes, I know how cops act. They're going to do this whole thing with the condoms based off of my daughter's commercial. Then when he goes to work, there's a condom bouquet. But he has a good spirit about it. He ends up chuckling and being like, oh, they got me.
That was an obvious callback, yeah.
Yeah. Another callback is the tuna, believe it or not.
That didn't build, though.
But they do mention it again later. So they're at the TV before the commercial, and he's trying to eat a tuna sandwich, and everyone's like, not tuna. And then later, Joe Pesci is complaining about his tuna sandwich in the car, and he won't eat it because of everything that's going on. Another one is the nail gun, obviously. So, the construction worker shoots the nail gun. They jump, they draw their weapons. Later, when Murtaugh's in the house alone and there's an attempt to kill him, he uses the nail gun to defeat them both. Even though this next callback is overused a lot, I actually really like it in this movie, which is 1, 2, 3, go. So earlier in the movie when they're with the Cougaran car, they're saying like 1, 2, 3, go, and Riggs takes off, and Murtaugh's like, oh, I missed it. Then later when they're on the toilet, they're gonna pull him off the toilet on 1, 2, 3, go, and they try to decide if it's on go or if it's on 3. And even though, you know, I've seen this in movies a million times, I actually really like it in this movie. I think that they play well. Another callback is Sam's dog hole. So while Riggs and Von House are getting it on, Sam the dog goes in his dog hole. And this is kind of a quick setup and callback because then once the choppers show up and they start shooting up the mobile home, Riggs and Von House go through the dog hole. Another callback, which is, this one is really kind of deep. And it's really interesting. There is a commercial that plays on the beginning of the movie when Riggs is in his mobile home, when Riggs is in his place, and it's for cologne. And then later when his place is getting shot up, that cologne is on the table. And it explodes. And I think they're just trying to double down on this idea that Riggs is back on the market. He's gotten over his dead wife. He's trying to get back with the ladies. And then the final callback, which I think is the most famous one, is the straitjacket. So Riggs is making money off the other police officers by getting out of a straitjacket because he dislocated his shoulder as a kid. Now he can do whatever he wants. Later, when the bad guys put him in a straitjacket at the bottom of the ocean, he dislocates his shoulder again, and he was able to break out of it. So that's going to be most of the callbacks that at least I registered. I'm sure there's more, but these are the ones that kind of stuck out the most to me. And then as far as one-liners go, there's a lot of them, but I think my 3 favorite are Wipeout. So they defeat the bad guy, the surfboard. They do a big kind of chase sequence with a guy driving a stolen truck, and then there's a big collision, and then the surfboard goes through the windshield, and it kills the bad guy who's driving the truck. And then after all the police show up, Riggs gets up, and he looks at the damage. He goes, oh, Wipeout. So there's that one. The second one is when Murtaugh defeats the 2 guys in his home with the nail gun, and he says, nailed them both. And then the last one is the iconic one, where you have Palpatine up on like the higher deck, and he goes diplomatic immunity, and Murtaugh does the neck thing, shoots him, and then goes, it's been revoked. So there are a lot more one-liners than that, but at least for me, like the Wipeout one is funny because it's just so like stupid. The I nailed them both feels like an improv line that he just tried out that they kept on the day.
Well, it's not I nailed them both, it's nailed them both.
Nailed them both. And then obviously...
Like he's doing commentary on his own murder.
And then obviously the famous one is it's been revoked, and you know, I don't have anything to say about that line that hasn't been said already. I like the line.
My favorite was nailed them both.
But it's like, who's he talking to?
Exactly. Or he's doing commentary.
So I think there's some more stuff that we want to talk about with this movie, but we can probably save it for our ranking. So as always on this podcast, we ask 3 questions that lead to a final vote of is it worth going back again? And the first question is, does it work as a sequel?
For me, it does work as a sequel. You've got the characters that we love coming back. They've got better chemistry. Honestly, that's enough to really cement it for me. If you've got the characters, they've still got their voice. They're the same characters that we know from the first one. And if they have, especially for something like this, which is like almost the epitome of like the buddy cop movie, if they've got the chemistry, then that's all you really need. Everything else with the good villain, with the character development for Riggs specifically, with the, more of his network of support now. Murtaugh doesn't really develop too much, but his character stays good. It's a little bit, I think he's definitely secondary to Riggs in both of these movies, but not by a lot. And his character still has a lot to work for, or has a lot to work with. For those, that's just kind of like the cherry on top. But especially for the characters, that's why it works as a sequel for me.
Yeah, it works as a sequel for me too. I think it's better than the original, to be honest. I think it's directed better. I think, like you said, the acting and the chemistry is better. And also, they really add more depth to the characters. I do agree that there is a lack of effort being put into Murtaugh, but Murtaugh is really entertaining in the whole movie.
I don't want to say it's lack of effort. I think it's just with...
There is a lack of writing with Murtaugh.
There's lack of, content,
Yeah, in the second one, but he is really entertaining, and they do give him a lot to do.
They give him a lot to do.
Which I think is nice with it. They give him a lot, because he gets all the family scenes. Like, we always going to meet
He gets the family scenes. He gets some good comedy, which he didn't really have in the first one. Mm-hmm. It's just the plot bends more toward Riggs.
And they finally introduce in this one, like, that he's starting to think about retirement because, he's getting too old for this shit.
Well, it's just like a one line.
Yeah, but they're kind of laying the foundation for kind of later movies.
I'm getting too old for this shit, this franchise?
Yeah, that's what they say at the end of the first movie. It's the last line of the first movie.
Oh, is it?
Yeah,
I
before he closes.
completely missed that.
Yeah, he twists the Christmas light, and before he closes the door, he goes, "I'm getting too old for this shit." And he closes the door.
Really?
Oh yeah.
Oh man, I can't believe I missed that. I feel so stupid.
Nah, it's okay. Well, you should feel, but you know. So that's going to be 2 check marks right off the bat. So the second question is going to be, is it enjoyable / entertaining? And I'll go ahead and start off this one, and I will say yes. It is enjoyable / entertaining. I think that this movie is more enjoyable and entertaining than the first one, mostly because there's a lot of drag in the opening of the first one, because like we said, you have to establish our characters, you have to have them meet, you have to have them argue and butt heads a little bit until they can kind of reconnect and come back together at the end. Whereas in this one, we jump right into the movie, almost like this is a television show, where it's like we're going right into a car chase, they're already yelling at each other, and the rest is really just kind of hanging out with these friends that are also cops, you know? And for me, especially when you add in the villains and the good acting of them, and also just treating them as an actual threat and having the balls to kill a lot of these cops. Like I kind of got reminded of The Dark Knight when they were killing those cops, where it's like, okay, we're treating our villains kind of seriously. So all those aspects just create an overall enjoyable experience that even if there's elements to this movie that you don't like, I still think that there's some things that you can find that you like. So for all those reasons, I do think it is enjoyable / entertaining.
It's going to be a check from me too. I did think it was more enjoyable than the first one. Like you said, everything is more refined, everything's more polished. So I feel like it needs to get a check on that front. However, it definitely gets a check from me based off of kind of knowing what it was before going into it and just kind of how famous it was, and being able to watch it through that lens, knowing what it was before going into it, and kind of being able to register the more campy elements of it. That really helped me kind of place the movie, and I think register it better for what it was, and that really helped me, I think, find it more enjoyable. So it didn't remind me necessarily, but it made me think of like a Verhoeven movie, or Paul Verhoeven, where if you don't know what you're signing up for, it's very jarring, I feel like. And I feel like that would have been the case for this. But knowing the cultural relevance and just kind of being able to identify it in history, I knew how to prepare for it. And I did think that it was a good representation of what it was, a good 80s action movie.
So it sounds like, yeah, it's going to be 2 check marks again. So the third question is, does it need to exist? And I just want to focus on this question really quick, because very similar to the first season of the show, you know, we were kind of talking about how you have this huge hit, and then because of that, they decide to make a sequel. And I just think that this question fits more in the action sequel verse, because oftentimes you're going to make one movie, it's going to kind of wrap up a story. Then after that success, they're like, well, let's bring all those characters back again, and let's give them like another bad guy to fight. And when you do that, you run the risk of, well, did you make this movie because you wanted to actually challenge our main characters with this villain? Or did you make this movie because you just wanted to bring back our protagonists just to fight a one-off villain again and just see them, just kind of hang out with these people? So with that being said, I think that that's going to be a good way to transition into our first movie for the sequel action list. And yeah, we're going to ask her right now, does Lethal Weapon 2 need to exist?
In the context of the action sequel verse, yes, I think it does. I think it's adding enough to action movies and kind of the encyclopedia of like tropes and stuff that action movies draw from. I think it's too important to the genre, the sequel of Lethal Weapon 2. I think it's too important to the genre to not exist. So it's going to be a check from me. It succeeds where it needs to. It lacks in places that I wish it wasn't, especially with side female characters specifically, and kind of just doing something that's more challenging than something that's more safe. But those aren't necessarily deal breakers. It succeeds on characters, and it succeeds on building on I don't want to say the mythology of action movies, but like the universe of action movies. So it's going to be a check for me.
Yeah, it's going to be a check for me too. And to kind of go off of what you said, the fact that they took stuff from the first one that worked and they expanded upon it, and then they also just made certain elements better. Like I said, I think it's directed better. I think it's performed better. I actually think, and this might be a little controversial to say, I think if you successfully established to somebody who had never seen this franchise before who these characters were and what their shtick was, I think you could just show them Lethal Weapon 2. I do think the first one is still entertaining, but I was worried when you watched it for the first time how you would feel about it, because I knew what Lethal Weapon 2 had to offer, and it was like, oh, we just got to get through Lethal Weapon 1. Upon rewatching it, I was a little softer on it. I still think there's a lot of good things in that movie. But this one really, I think, is the cornerstone of the franchise, and they don't get much better after this. So for all those reasons, I do think it needs to exist. And if you're doing math at home, that's going to be 6 check marks, no X's, and it's going to get 1 giant check mark for worth going back again. You know, when you look back at season 1, there's really only 3 movies that kind of pass all these questions of, is it worth going back again?
And one of them just because of Glenn Close.
Yeah. Well, that made it into sequel limbo. But in regards to what we're talking about with like one movie that is successful and then they continue that story with those characters. And really, if you want to break it down, it's like, I like watching those characters solve crimes or fight in the first one. I want to see them do it again. I think this movie is kind of the epitome of what that looks like when it's done right. So I think it's a good way to start it off. And yeah, I wanted you to at least see this one first before we kind of get into some worse action sequels. That way you have somewhat of a palette of understanding.
Like a baseline?
Yeah, so you have somewhat of a baseline of taste in regards to how we're gonna kind of rank these going forward. But right out the gate for this one, yeah, it's gonna be a check mark, and it's gonna start off the season on a pretty strong note. So that's going to be a wrap on Lethal Weapon 2. As always, everyone, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Make sure you like, subscribe, that you comment below. It's the beginning of the season. We got 11 more action movie sequels that we're going to be doing. Don't want to spoil what's coming up next, but make sure you tune in next week to see which action movie sequel that we do. Tell us what you think. Have you seen Lethal Weapon 2? Do you like it? Let us know what we missed. But yeah, outside of that, I think we're just going to see you here again, back again for episode 2 of the now action movie sequel podcast. And yeah, you got anything else to add, Drew?
Vroom, vroom.
Oh no. And all right, we'll see you next time.
I'm back again.